All right, everyone. It is time for another episode of Any War Game Anytime. It's just me today. Boz and Sam are out. They've got, both of them are in sort of a big, a lot of stuff going on in life right now. We'll just sort of say that, but they're both doing great. Talk with them both constantly. They're just, that's how life is sometimes. But we've got an awesome guest here today. Is it Scanner? Or can I call you Mr. Scanner? I feel I should call you can I call you Mr. Scanner?
Definitely not Mr. Scanner.
Well, it's Scanner from the YouTube channel Scanner Barkley. We're so happy to have him on. We've been following his work. He does really cool stuff, and we're going to get into that in a little bit about his YouTube channel, specifically about Trench Crusade. But before we do into that, I just so Scanner, tell us a little bit about your history in wargaming.
Yeah, okay. I guess I was one of those people. I'm old enough to have been fortunate to receive when I was quite young for Christmas a copy of Hero Quest and a my best buddy, I guess, at the time received I think very close, if not the same Christmas, unless I'm mixing up my dates. He got like Space Crusade.
Oh wow, yeah.
So that was like a double whammy intro to how much fun it could be to move little pieces of plastic around on a table and have some rules and monsters trying to eat your face.
Hmm.
And from there we pretty naturally graduated, I guess, into Warhammer 40K and Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I kind of honed in on Chaos as a faction that I really liked, and I wasn't like hugely original. I guess I played Chaos in 40K and in Warhammer Fantasy Battle and in Necromunda. I had like converted Chaos cultists, playing as Cawdor, I think it was that we house ruled them as. And I was lucky enough to kind of, I think, be growing up and interested in wargaming when it was still trying to figure itself out.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Creatively, it was obviously people were trying to sell us things. I'm not saying that's
It was
not the
different
case.
though, but it was
Yeah,
different.
yeah, they were trying a little. They were experimenting, and they hadn't quite figured out whatever little formulas let them know exactly where the benefit is to how much of X or Y or Z to sell, and things felt kind of fun and interesting. I got into uh just before I went to college, I guess I got into D&D in a pretty big way, and then in college it was all the World of Darkness stuff,
Mhm.
Cyberpunk 2021. There was, because of costs, when all you had to do was buy a rule book and sit there with your, the theater of the mind, that became the more affordable process than buying a bunch of plastic models and paints and all that. So I became very much an RPG guy and just kind of had a lot of fun in and out over the years. Life gets busy sometimes. I think for, I would say, a big chunk of my late 20s, there was very little. It became a career focus
Mhm.
kind of a thing, but I kind of got sick of working for people and being career focused, and now I work for myself and I have time to do the things that I want to do. So I've been firmly back into wargaming, I guess, for the last 6 or 7 years. Pretty hard, just re-exploring everything, reading a lot. I have I love rule books
Mhm. Yeah.
specifically. Just, my wife laughs at me. I sit there like reading, the second edition rule book as if it's a
Oh,
novel sometimes.
they are. I mean,
Oh yeah.
I think you're probably can you maybe you can I'll have you speak for yourself, but I got into wargaming, and especially you're right, those early editions of 40K and Games Workshop, where I always say back when White Dwarves used to be an awesome magazine and not just sort of I was there when it sort of turned into a lot more of just basically a sales pitch. White
Yes.
Dwarves used to be amazing. and I was really happy to be because I got into wargaming at such a young age. It really profoundly affected my outlook on life, probably a certain level of my philosophy as well. And it's interesting that we're going to talk about that with talking about something like Trench Crusade, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say the parallels for Trench Crusade and Warhammer 40K, there are some parallels that I, I, I sort of see there. What do you think about that? How do you feel about the parallels between the two?
Yes, I've chatted a little bit about it with the devs, and I don't think it's possible for Tomas, the guy who's writing all the rules and the lore, to have learned from Rick Priestley
Mhm.
and Jervis Johnson
Yeah,
and those type of creatives and not have there's little fingerprints of their process and their
exactly.
inspirations. And I think that's really interesting. It's an example of something that we're only now really starting to see, I guess, of generational game design, because a game designer can learn from somebody, and there is now the facilities to go off and potentially succeed on a big scale and to produce completely independently.
Yeah, yeah.
Because Trench Crusade is three people.
Mhm.
There's Tomas on the rules, Mike doing all the art, and James Sheriff doing the layouts and kind of leading the sculpting troupe, as it
Mhm.
were. And there's no interference. If the three of them like it, they just do it. So it
Mhm.
becomes this very pure thing. And I think in a major way, Tomas is he's never said this, but he's potentially designing the game he might have done in 1999 if there was nobody in his way.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right. I can't help but feel there was something about now I didn't play Rogue Trader. I read some of the stuff after the fact, but I was right in the mix on second edition. And there is I feel a little bit of second edition in Trench Crusade where it's not quite as polished. 40K the lore has become it's become a little too fantastic, a little more polished than what a little less mysterious.
Yeah.
That but let's not so we know 40K well. So let's you've been talking about it a little bit. So what sort of drew you to Trench Crusade? Was it the lore, the models, the game mechanics? What would you say really drew you to this game?
The initial hook was the artwork of the anti-tank communicant that was doing the rounds on
Hmm.
Twitter. That got me onto the original Kickstarter, which I backed, and I got those original models. And at the time, it was just the anti-tank communicant, the ammo monk, and a couple of extras like the witch burner maybe and the medic and things like that. There was no game, and it was actually that same thing that got all of us early fans intrigued. Is the same thing that got Tomas intrigued apparently, and he just kind of like hooked up with Mike and James and was like, I can totally do a game
Yeah.
about this if you guys are down. So it was kind of everything. I think for people my age, Tomas as a designer matters.
Yeah.
Um, he is from that golden age of White Dwarf where things were amazing, and I felt like I knew the people
Yep.
who were in the
Exactly.
magazine. I felt like if I walked into a pub with Andy Chambers, I would be able to hold a conversation for him that was embarrassing for neither of us.
Hmm.
And it was a really interesting connection that they had as a staff with the people who made the hobby. So I wanted to kind of reconnect, I think, almost with that part of my life
Yeah.
in a way, like the ultimate. I guess I'm a xenial. So the xenial midlife crisis, because none of us have any money, needs to be pretty low budget. I can't go buy a convertible and rip around the roads in it. So I will instead purchase out of production Games Workshop models, and I'll back things on Kickstarter.
Yeah.
So it gave me that. And then it's just,
I think for me, it's sucking up to any person who has a 3D printer so that they'll print me stuff on
yeah,
it. I would
make us
love to
some stuff.
buy, and I would love to still buy Games Workshop. I just can't. Yeah, I mean, like, it just can't afford it.
It just doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment
No.
financially with the way they're kind of driving things. I think for Trench Crusade, it's the word I see described amongst, I guess, my community, as scary as those two words are in conjunction, is it's kind of gnarly.
Yeah.
Um, I see a lot of folks leave comments on my videos sometimes describing things as venturing into like grim derp as
Huh.
opposed to grim dark. But you maybe will agree with this. Back in the day, everything was grim derp, and that's what we
It's.
liked about it.
I would say that, like, I haven't read it. I've just followed your work, and maybe it's how you present it. But there is, like I said, it feels a little 80s and 90s GW, where there is this very, and it's so clear, like 40K to these days, and I haven't even followed the lore probably for about 10 years. It's just every time I hear about it, it feels so different. But you're at least from what I'm hearing what you talk about Trench Crusade, it hits something. Let's get into, and man, I could we're gonna try to keep this time boxed because but so first thing, let's talk about the lore. um so for me, I would say, I'm a Christian, and I think it's really fascinating that I take this step about Trench Crusade. One, I would say this way: it feels that games and this media, there has always been, I think we have to call it a trope now, right? Where it's like, X religion is bad, let's create a story about how bad it is, and maybe just sort of just tweak the names and the colors, right? It's sort of this very over the top veiled attempt that's just saying X religion is terrible, and we're going to change the little names, and look how, for me, it feels a little more like a trope these days, where it's
Yeah.
like, it just seems like, I'm not against anyone doing it. It just feels like that well has just been gone to so many times. And then with Trench Crusade, we see something. One, they're just out front with it. This is Christianity. I mean, it's just really in your face. Like, I've never seen anything like it. It's just bam. And secondly, they take a much more nuanced approach about religion, especially basing it off the Crusade. And we could all go on and on about that, about religion in a different time, and how there was a certain necessary evil about, or even evil, just the necessity of religion. That I think it's so different than I've really been seeing. Sort of, would you call that a trope these days, about how it's just? What do you kind of feel about what I'm talking about here?
I would. I've always maintained I was raised Catholic
Hmm.
and I guess would now describe myself as agnostic.
Hmm.
And I've always felt there was a degree of comfort involved in my ability to say I'm agnostic
Yeah.
because being from Ireland 100 years ago, I 100% would have been Catholic, and there would have been a lot of very heavy political and social weight on that Catholicism. And if you go back far enough, I've always considered it kind of, I don't think anybody 15,000 years ago walks out of a cave, looks up at the sky, sees stars, and thinks, yeah, and nothing bigger than me exists. Like the idea of having a God and a religious connection, I feel, is a very natural
Hmm.
human thing to strive for. So this game obviously does it in a very grim at times way, but something about it feels like a reasonably natural exploration sometimes of there's a necessary hardship to endure.
Yeah. It's much more real, even though it's so over the top. There's something for me a little more real in how they sort of portray, and they are portraying religion. It's up front and center. It's right there. And I find it's much more like, I mean, I listen to these. I've read stories about how, like I said, sort of the I find it so fascinating. They just put it up front and center and they portray it, but it feels a little more real than what I felt. It's a little more of a trope these days where it's like we're gonna just tweak the window dressing. We're basically gonna say how religion is bad, right? I don't know. It feels, you remember wrong, it just feels a little more real. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting because even in its grimmer interpretations within the lore, like if you take something like a Shrine Antioch
Mm.
or Shrine Anchorite, and you think about the fact that that's like a big, almost medievally vehicle that's got a person inside of it that is suffering in its mechanisms in order to work it. It sounds crazy. Like it sounds like why would anybody do that to themselves? But then the inherent level of faith and belief required to do that to yourself for something that you see as being justified, in this case, the reason it's justified is the defense of others against the onslaught of hell. There's actually a lot of the kind of exploration of the strength of the human spirit in there rather than mockery. It's not a
Yeah,
case of look how stupid this guy is getting in this thing. It's like he knows it's going to be bad. He knows it's going to be an awful experience. He does it anyway because of the people that need protecting.
it another thing that's really fascinating to me is they're they are pulling, and it's really funny, the Bible, they're pulling a lot of stuff from the Bible. I mean, how can we not talk about some of the references about the Bible? And the Bible sometimes I feel has gotten more whitewashed in recent political times, but the Bible is an absolutely bonkers book. I mean,
Yes.
it is a book written, and I think even to its own acknowledgement, it's a very highly figurative book and a very cryptic book. And yet I find it's very fascinating that they take almost sort of a very literal approach. Like they did this recent one in this demon, right, where they literally they modeled it exactly off the what's it word the translation in Revelations,
Yeah, the pit
how John
locusts.
described it. They took that and they said, because that's in the Bible, it's like this crazy sort of very highly figurative. And I think it's interesting that they just say, oh yeah, that's the model, boom, um that's really fascinating to me. And even just some of the details, how they dig into the fact of Antioch being the birthplace of Christianity. It's very like I find it fascinating that they seem to really be digging into the details and studying the Bible to, and I haven't seen that with any sort of game. It's very fascinating. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think they're doing for the size of their team. I know they have some like advisors who are deeply knowledgeable about, various subjects like Christianity, for example. I think they're doing the best that they can to maintain a degree of sense and logic within a pretty insane world to
Hmm.
be exploring. And mostly they seem to be falling into a kind of a rule of cool
Hmm.
kind of vibe. So that description of the pit locusts from Revelations is really cool. Like they sound very terrifying as creatures. So if you're looking for a monster for a game and the Bible has this very terrifying creature, then it does kind of make sense for them to go, well, this is it. We've got our thing. Like it's meant to inspire terror in the people who hear those little buzzing wings. And if I heard those little buzzing wings and then that's what I'm seeing, I would be very much terrified and likely no longer agnostic. So
Hmm.
it makes a lot of sense.
So I want to get your opinion. Do you think that, so maybe this is too simplistic. Do you think the lore is anti-religion, pro-religion, or somehow somewhere in the middle? Um,
I actually think about this a lot, not just with Trench Crusade, but with a lot of media right now. I think there's too much of a rush sometimes to compare the media that we are creating and consuming to the actual real world.
mhm.
Everything needs to be like nobody when I was a kid ever asked me if I thought Nurgle was relevant to Beelzebub and relevant to the ancient religions of Mesopotamia.
Mhm.
Not once in my entire life was I asked that question. And now all of a sudden it's part of the discourse to figure out, do I think this thing is pro or anti something that's very important to me? As if we're ready to instantly jump to the point of liking it or not liking it for reasons outside of its creative or artistic merit,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. So I feel like only the devs could say whether they felt it was pro or anti anything. My interpretation of it is that I don't necessarily think it's either. I think it's a creative endeavor
Hmm.
as opposed to a theological or anti-theological endeavor. How people wish to interpret it. Like there's quite a few um in the official Discord, let's say, we have a lot of like Christian players
Mhm. Yeah.
who love it because it's very metal exploration of their religion, and
They hit details. As a
that's cool.
person, I know I have a certain respect for it that they get some of the finer details right that I appreciate. Little details like Antioch, that are just, it's a little detail that a lot of people don't, that thing is interesting. I agree with it. There's a certain, if anything else, there's a certain creative homage, that, yeah, it's very fascinating. I don't see any other thing like it. Not right now, at least.
Yes, it's definitely unique in the landscape right now, which I think is one of the reasons why a lot of people also like it.
Mhm. So let's talk about. We mentioned it a little bit, the differences and similarities between 40K and Trench Crusade. So, what I have heard before, kind of using you as my gateway into this, is that it's sort of 40K on steroids. Do you agree or disagree with that sort of thought, that statement?
That's another, I'm going to come off really curmudgeonly, I think, at different points during this
Hmm.
conversation, because I feel like with so much of the quote unquote hobby being Warhammer, I think that's the sometimes only point of reference that people actually have. It's like, oh, it's a guy in a suit of armor, it's a space marine.
Yeah.
It's like, well, have you ever heard of like Bauhaus from Warzone or anything like that? So I don't think 40K on steroids really cuts it, because 40K as a product and as an artistic endeavor is just way too complicated, and it has changed so much over the years.
Yeah.
And it's even changed a lot for and against the tides of what the characters within the universe would want.
Mm.
Like, the Emperor starts out as being let's not do the religion thing. Let's like think about the universe and expand into it and be mankind. And everyone's like, okay, Emperor, you're the boss. And then he dies, and then he's the god. And it's like, it's a kind of a fun, natural progression of things. This one is more like, uh, yeah, it's just interesting. I would definitely not say like 40K on steroids. I think it is 100% bringing all that weird schlock horror energy that 40K had in the 80s and
Yeah.
90s.
Yeah. Had. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the connection that people are making to it. It's like listening to a band you've never heard before that reminds you of the band you listened to when you were 17, 18, hanging with your friends.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I think even though obviously 40K pulls certain, I guess I've heard that statement and I slightly agree to it in that 40K obviously has some very Christian overtones with the emperor, and of course there is a twist on it about how he's technically not for religion. He gets turned into a religion, and how religion is. He thought it was bad, but it's actually kind of good because it's keeping things together. So what I find it's interesting, one, they 40k early 40k lore does pull into this sort of grim necessity for something like, obviously the Imperium does terrible things, and yet there is this grim necessity that I think you're right. That sort of connection is how I make that connection between Grim Crusade and that early 40k, right? Where there is that real important grimness, but also the necessity to do it, right? What is your alternative? It's, some pretty crazy stuff.
Exactly. The difference in these considerations will always be scale.
Yeah.
It's super easy to you write a hero who faces a challenge and decides to be the bigger entity and die rather than become the bad thing necessary to stop the challenge. And that's fine if that's a decision that the hero is making for the hero. If the
Yeah.
hero is making that decision for the rest of mankind, I would argue the hero just has to shut up and do the necessity, save mankind.
Mm.
That's the difference in scale a little bit, I think, in these stories. And both Trench Crusade and 40k explore that much bigger choice
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
that needs to be made. The Trench Pilgrims, New Antioch, the Iron Sultanate, they're all operating from the point of view of they're doing what they deem as necessary to ensure the survival of basically everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the fun of it, right? Figuring out where are they going a little bit too far, is creating completely artificial life in their labs by the alchemists a big no-no for the Iron Sultanate. Is the idea of the ecclesiastic prisoners for the trench pilgrims. That's definitely not something I feel like, most uh the kind of takes on Christianity would be particularly cool with. But these
You
are all
mean
things
that's
that
the
that are
ones?
necessary.
Is that the ones that they strap bombs to themselves and
Yeah,
run
they
into?
put the bombs
But
on
that, I
them,
mean,
and
there's strokes of that, especially in the Crusade era. A lot of people did go to the Crusade to have their sins absolved, and that was a part of, and well, we could. I could start talking about this stuff for hours with you. We're gonna time box it because it's so true. I wanted to get into this interview, and there's so much that I think we could delve into, but I want to provide a critique. Okay, so we've talked some good things. For me, I'll give you a critique that I have about it, and I'll see if you agree or disagree. One, so I'm a big fan of Divine Comedy by Dante. That's a love a book. I think it's a very important piece. And I know they've referenced the nine circles of hell and they've mentioned some of the characters. They are pulling that, but I don't see a lot of other Dante that. Am I wrong? I don't see a lot of. They're not really pulling from that well a lot. Where I think they really could. Um, I think as a person myself, I get a little frustrated when people use the divine comedies and like Devil May Cry is a really annoying piece of storyline and artwork for me. How they take this very nuanced and like, oh yeah, it's just, I don't know. So what do you think about that? First of all, am I wrong? Are they pulling a lot of the Divine Comedy? I'd love to see them pull more into that. Um,
no, I think you're right. I think they're definitely taking little bits and pieces from many different places. And I have to imagine part of the reason for that is if they overcommit to a singular source of inspirations,
mhm,
they're really just making a game about the Divine Comedy
yeah.
at that point. And the other problem that they would have is small teams, small focus, ship what you're working on right now and worry about the rest later,
Mhm,
I guess has to be forefront in their mind. So I really wouldn't be shocked to see a lot more fall in down the road. But for now, it's pretty clear they've got the six factions that they have to
mhm,
focus in on. They want to do a lore and art book with the Kickstarter. All the lore needs to be written. So that's more work. All the art needs to be done, and that's predominantly going to be Mike. And they so it feels like a necessity to just pull the cool bits and
Mhm.
use their I guess I'm just gonna call them a team of scholars, I guess, to make sure that they're not doing anything too stupid or silly with the
Yeah.
things that are inspiring them, and just go from there.
Hmm. Okay. Well, it sounds so you're I'm not as up to speed with everything, but you're saying the lore is still a long ways from, I guess, being fully developed. Is this a Do you know if they're going to have a living lore? Is there going to be some sort of campaign, or do you have any inside knowledge about where they are as far as their lore being complete or comprehensive or
My understanding is that they want to kind of have a timeline cutoff point, at least technologically.
Mhm.
They're willing to push things up to about World War II ish because of the upshot of having miracles on your side is that sometimes you're better at doing things than we might have been historically, and one of those things is like metallurgy. Um, very, greatly improved metals and alloys and things, so they can push tech a little bit harder. And the lore, I know they want to do about 80 pages if they can
Mhm.
for the lore book, but they would be nowhere near having cemented a full lore even in that, because that will just be focusing in on the six factions. There'll be huge parts of the world left unexplored, and how all those parts of the world interact with each other, or the factions that we've got, or the trials and tribulations that they face. Um, so yeah, it feels like
Yeah, I guess I would say there is. I feel at least there's a lot of room maybe for books. Like, I guess I want to
yes,
know, are they thinking that far or are they not? They're sort of in just, they're not really thinking that. They're just sort of focused. It sounds like they're focused on the task at hand, which is sort of what you're saying, right?
yeah,
Just,
I think they're focused but scalable
yeah,
at this
yeah.
point. In the last Q&A we did with them in the Discord, we actually asked about books, and they said they've had interest from, I guess, people that do that kind of thing for a living, who want to, write stories within the world of Trench Crusade, but they're just not willing to do anything formally or officially or get anything rolling until they would see what kind of
Hmm,
scale it is that they'll be operating at. Until that Kickstarter happens, they won't even know
that makes
if
sense.
they would be able to pay an author, and they just don't want to work with anybody with those unknowns, with those uncertainties.
Yeah. I mean, like I do like that you're saying it's scalable. There does in this lore, there feels like a lot of legs. And in that way, I hope my critique is more of a, I guess it's more of an ask. I would love if they would delve a little more into I think to me, the Divine Comedy it fits right with this story. And I guess I would love for them to pull a little bit more. Maybe it's less a critique and more a request. How about we just leave it at that? And
Yeah, no, exactly. We've all definitely got, I think everyone who's enjoying what they're seeing in the game, we've all got little things that we'd love to have expanded. But mostly I think we just want to get to the Kickstarter so we can see all the finished models and know exactly what it is that our options are. Because outside of the lore and how interesting it is, it's also an extremely satisfying game to play.
is it good? Okay, I haven't. I've watched some. Yeah, I was going to ask you, how is the gameplay?
It's quite neat. It's very interesting, and it takes some getting used to for an old head like me who's used to the way that things normally go. So what I really like is just kind of a broken up order of how you can do things. You can like move your character and shoot somebody and then try and dash,
Hmm,
or you can do your charge and whack somebody and then try and dash. Like there's always a risky dash that you can take
hmm,
that is fun because your failure chance to success chance is by 50-50, but it means you can't bank on it, but it's constantly tempting.
Yeah.
And that makes it fun. The blood markers mechanic is really interesting. As your kind of characters get hurt, they build up these things called blood markers. And let's say I injure your unit and you're trying to shoot back at me, I can actually use the blood marker to mess with your dice pool a little bit.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
reducing your chances of success, or if you've got them on me, you can use them to increase your chances of success if you're trying to hit me.
Yeah.
So it
I'd love
just
to,
it's
yeah, I'd
fun.
love
It's
to
there's always a reason to pay attention during the other person's turn.
yeah. I'd love to check it out. I think when this Kickstarter is I'm more following the lore now. You're right. I'm sort of waiting for the rules to settle in because I don't want to. I'm one of these people that when I dig into a rule set, I can just start get very nitpicking. I don't want to do that now. I don't want to start. It's not even a finished. I don't want to get too nitpicky about that. Um, well, Trench Crusade, like I said, if anything else, an interesting time to be a wargamer. So tell us a little bit. If you could pick some sci-fi and fantasy lore, what's your favorite? So for a war game, what's your favorite sci-fi and fantasy lore? You can pick one or pick both, or anything, not just Games Workshop, or anything really.
From an existing
I would say
game,
from a war game. Maybe we like to try and put it. You can go out there. We like to say, what's your favorite lore from a war game or a game?
I've always really liked BattleTech.
Mm,
There's something really almost disturbingly realistic and natural about the way the BattleTech universe is.
yeah.
That's hugely appealing. Um, Many of the pieces of fiction, I guess, I've read from the Battlefield or BattleTech universe just feel real in a way that many games don't, which is a huge amount of fun. And I also love the universe of Infinity
Oh
by,
yeah.
by Corvus Belli. That's a really, it's got that same thing, but it's like in space, it's got those real world inspirations. Like you got your Pan Oceania, who are very religiously themed uh, kind of factions, and people who very obviously draw their origins back to elements of Earth.
Mm.
I think is always very cool and interesting. So they would definitely be my two. And then frankly for fantasy style stuff, I have to give that one just to the old world
Hmm.
Warhammer Fantasy Battle. It was just everything to us when we were
Especially
kids.
those 80s and 90s. That's when fantasy. I mean, the game was absolutely broken. It was a silly game, but the lore was so good. And
Yeah.
you're right. Chaos back then, there was just this derpiness about them that was
Yeah, they were
super
silly, they were
interesting.
more fun, they were more interesting. What I liked, I was actually talking to people about this during the week, and what I really liked about Chaos back in the day was how disparate it was. You would have your Corn guys beside your Nurgle guys, beside your Slaanesh guys, beside your
Yeah.
bog standard Chaos Warriors.
Hmm.
And it was fun and interesting and bright and challenging to both control and fight. And now it's like, oh, I'm fighting Corn. Okay, I'll bring a lot of guns.
Yeah.
Like it's that rock paper scissors element of the modern game has unfortunately settled in. Even there, even amongst chaos, there is nothing but order now in the Games Workshop product.
Well, that's cool. And I've purposefully stayed away from BattleTech because I have friends who tell me the lore is very dense but very grounded.
Yeah.
And I really do want to get into it. I'm like you mentioned, we have all sorts of obligations, including just this YouTube channel. So I'm trying to pick my poison here. But I am going to try to get into Trench Crusade. I'm making room for it when it comes out because I do. I do find this game very fascinating. All right, so let's get to one last question. We always ask this for our guests. So tell me, if time and money were not a factor, if you were a billionaire and you just had all the time in the world, you know, what would your dream wargaming experience be? So just no holds barred, your dream wargaming experience.
It's going to sound very grounded,
You know,
given the idea of being a billionaire, but I've always just loved a fully decked out 6x4 table, beautiful terrain. I would pay very talented people to paint very beautiful armies for me. It would just be that normal wargaming experience, but just like dialed up
Mhm.
to 1,000. Like I remember when I was a kid, ironically, I would always be standing. I would go to mass on a Sunday morning, and my best friend would also go to mass, and then we'd meet after mass, and we just kind of stand outside the church talking about Warhammer, and that was always the dream. The dream is just to have that big experience, but a big experience when you're a kid is just your current experience just scaled up in quality for the most part. So just that beautiful 6x4 table, all the terrain expertly created, all the armies expertly painted, and just lots of people having a very kind of fun time.
Very
Um,
cool. Yeah.
would literally just be my dream experience, I think. Just nice and simple, nothing too complicated.
If it were there, I have to ask you because I'm a mass battles guy, and I would love to see like an epic version of Trench Crusade. I don't know that maybe this is wishful thinking. That's fine, but I would love to do like a mass battle of Trench Crusade where you've got like I just imagine like you got these hordes of these demonic people and like you got what are those bomber witches who were teleporting bombs on
Yeah, the
like,
artillery witches.
like, I'm just imagining a
Oh yeah.
war on a grand scale, and that would be to me like one of the most craziest like mass battles games ever.
Yeah, definitely. I would also say never discount what passionate members of the community will do
Mm.
in their spare time, because the chance of somebody else having that exact same thought and going, I'm just going to put it together in Tabletop Simulator and see what I can do is actually pretty high, I would say.
Yeah, I'm a one
So,
page rules guy, so I've thought about I'm into 6 mil and we've got some custom rule sets. I've thought about like, oh, if we could like get some 6 mil Trench Crusade with OPR, that'd be cool. Man, Scanner, thank you so much. It's been, like I said, I say this to a lot of guests. Like, I could go on. There's like a million other questions I'd love to ask you, but I'm going to refrain. Thank you so much, Scanner, for coming on our podcast. So we're going to put your links in the description. Is there any things that you would like to tell our audience where they can find you? And then also tell us of anything you got planned in the future.
yeah, I guess I'm terrible at self-promotion.
Hmm.
So there is a Twitter account, Scanner Barkley, and the YouTube account, obviously, Scanner Barkley. But I tend to keep it pretty focused. I'm not much of a I'm not a TikTok guy or an Instagram person or anything. I just like to do my thing on YouTube. And for the future, I'm really just very interested in exploring the things that I like in interesting ways that are fun and focusing on that. I think, at the risk of being a little preachy, I think people give way too much of their mind and their heart over now to the things that they don't like.
Mm,
And I don't have a huge amount of interest in talking about stuff I don't like, because the least important thing to the people who like that stuff should be whether I don't like it.
that's a good
So
point.
I'm just going to focus in. I'm going to do Trench Crusade lore. I would love to explore Mordheim lore
Yeah.
and a couple of older games that I think could be kind of cool and groovy. I'm figuring out how I want to approach battle reports.
Mhm.
Right now, I just published today a kind of a story report. Basically, we played a game over the weekend, and I wrote up narratively what occurred, and I gave everybody their thoughts and motivations and things of that nature. So just using, just if you want to see a guy trying to figure out how to polish up his writing a little bit and probably not paint the projects he says he's going to paint and be confused about 3D printing and just probably have the very same unpolished hobby experience that you're having, and that's me.
Yeah.
Just here trying to have fun and appreciate everybody's creativity and passion and talent. That's what I'm about.
Scanner, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. It was lovely to be here. Thank you.
All right.